April 10th, 1942. The road out of Mariveles, Bataan. For 75,000 captured American and Filipino soldiers, it was the beginning of the end. A 65-mile road to a place called Camp O'Donnell. It was not a camp. It was a grave. The Japanese Imperial Army expected a swift victory. They found a bitter, protracted fight. Now they demanded a march. No food, no water. Just the sun, the dust, and the endless road. The men stumbled forward, their bodies broken by dysentery and malaria, their hope evaporating under the bayonets of their captors. They died by the hundreds, then by the thousands. They died from thirst. They died from exhaustion. They died from a soldier's casual cruelty. The official Japanese report, filed under Incident 42B, would later speak of military necessity and the unfortunate consequences of a logistical failure. It was a lie. Everybody knew it was a lie. But something else was happening. Something the reports failed to mention. A whisper in the sugarcane fields. A shadow in the jungle twilight. Men vanished from the death march. Not just a few stragglers who collapsed and were left for dead. They disappeared. One moment, a soldier named Lieutenant Edwin Ramsey was collapsing in the line. The next, he was gone, pulled into the green darkness. He was a ghost. They were all ghosts. The Japanese command saw only chaos, the random luck of the desperate. They failed to see the network. An invisible army was moving through the mountains and villages of the Philippines, an army of farmers, teachers, and teenagers. They called themselves guerrillas. Led by audacious figures like Captain Jesus Villamor, a decorated pilot, and the formidable American journalist turned fighter, Yai Panlilio, they were watching the columns of the dead and dying. They were counting. They were planning. They were pulling ghosts from the road to hell. These forgotten testimonies and redacted after-action reports do not just tell a story of survival. They reveal how a phantom force outsmarted an empire, smuggling out not just living men, but the truth of the atrocity itself. August 29th, 1945. Letterman General Hospital, San Francisco. The man in the bed weighed 97 pounds. He was a captain. U.S. Army, Medical Corps. His eyes were hollowed out, dark pools in a skull stretched thin with yellowed skin. He spoke. The stenographer's fingers flew. The tape recorder spooled silently. This was the first official testimony. The first time the words were put on paper. The first time the ghosts were given a voice. Nobody believed the rumors. Not really. Whispers from escaped men, from Filipino guerrillas, from signals intelligence intercepts. The folder in the War Department was thin. Codenamed Alamo, it spoke of a surrender, of prisoners of war. But the details were missing. The truth was missing. The truth was in that hospital room. And it was worse than any rumor. It began on April 9th, 1942. That was the day the music died. General Edward P. King, Jr., a man who had seen the inevitable, surrendered the Luzon force. His men were starving. They were sick. They were out of ammunition. 75,000 of them. 12,000 Americans. 63,000 Filipinos. The largest surrender in American military history. They thought the fighting was over. They thought the worst was behind them. They were wrong. The Japanese were not prepared. They had expected maybe 25,000 prisoners. Not 75,000. They had no plan. No food, no water, no medicine, no transport for this ghost army. So they decided to walk them 65 miles north, from the tip of the Bataan Peninsula at Mariveles to a railhead at San Fernando. The folder contained a map, hand-drawn by a survivor. A single meandering red line. A scar on the face of Luzon. Mariveles, Limay, Balanga, Orani, San Fernando. Each name a station of the cross. The march started immediately. No rest, no food, just the road. The sun was the first enemy. A white, merciless eye in the sky. Men called it the sun treatment. Guards forced them to sit for hours in the open, in the dust, under the full glare of the tropical sun. No shade, no cover, no water. Men's brains began to cook inside their skulls. They went mad. They saw rivers where there was only dust. They saw home. Private John Riley from Cleveland, Ohio, age 19. He wrote about it in a diary he kept on scraps of paper, a diary later found on his body. Sun, so hot. Can't think. Men falling, just falling. That was his last entry. The thirst was a living thing, a monster that clawed at their throats. They passed artesian wells, pure, cool water bubbling up from the earth. The guards would laugh. Sometimes they would shoot the well, breaking the pipe. Sometimes they would let a few men drink, then bayonet them as they knelt. Men became so desperate they drank from stagnant carabao wallows, from ditches thick with scum and writhing larvae. They knew it was a death sentence. Dysentery. It was just a slower death than a bullet, a choice of dying tomorrow instead of today. It was the only choice they had. And then came the beatings. The guards were brutal. Some were Japanese regulars. Some, they whispered, were Korean conscripts, hated by all. It didn't matter. A rifle butt to the face for stumbling. A bayonet in the back for falling, for not keeping up, for looking the wrong way. They called it being gooned. A system emerged from the chaos, a system of murder. Behind the main column, there was a cleanup squad. Their job was simple. Kill anyone who could not walk. A single shot. Sometimes for sport, they used a sword. A beheading. Quick, efficient. The column never stopped. They just heard the shot. And they knew. Another one gone. Captain Eugene Nielsen of the 31st Infantry. He saw it, he told the investigators in that San Francisco hospital. They took a Filipino soldier. He'd fallen out. They made him dig his own grave. Right there on the side of the road. Then the officer took out his sword, and he swung it, just like that. We had to keep marching. We had to step around the body. His body. Starvation was the constant companion. 1 ball of rice a day? Maybe. Sometimes nothing for days. Men chewed on leather from their belts, on leaves, on weeds, anything to fill the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs. Their bodies consumed themselves. First the fat, then the muscle, then the organs. They became walking skeletons. Skeletons in rags caked in dirt and their own filth. The road from Mariveles to San Fernando, a 65-mile-long grave. At San Fernando, the ordeal changed. They were herded into steel boxcars, the kind used for hauling sugarcane. The sun had baked them into ovens. 100 men, sometimes more, were crammed into a single car designed for 40. There was no air, no room to sit, no room to breathe. The doors were bolted shut. The trip to Capas was only 30 miles. It took 4 hours. Men suffocated. They died standing up, held in place by the press of bodies. Those who survived stood on the corpses of their comrades. The stench of sweat, urine, feces, and death was unimaginable. It was a taste in your mouth, a coating on your skin. When the doors were finally unbolted at Capas, the dead fell out onto the platform. The living stumbled out after them. But it wasn't over, not yet. From Capas, another march, 8 more miles, to a place called Camp O'Donnell, a half-finished Filipino army base. This was the destination. This was the promised land, the end of the line. They arrived to find hell. Barren ground, a few bamboo and nipa huts, and a single water spigot for thousands of men. The dying accelerated. Malaria, beriberi, dysentery, starvation. The 4 horsemen of O'Donnell. 500 men died on the first day. 500. That's more than the combat deaths at Pearl Harbor. 500 men in one day. The official tally is an estimate, a guess? A number too large to comprehend. During the march itself, perhaps 750 Americans died. Perhaps 10,000 Filipinos. 10,000. An entire division of ghosts left on the road. At Camp O'Donnell, the numbers became a blur. In 2 months, another 1,600 Americans would be dead. Another 26,000 Filipinos. 26,000. The population of a small city erased. The man in the hospital bed in San Francisco stopped talking. The stenographer's hands ached. The tape recorder spooled to its end. He looked at the investigator, his hollow eyes burning with a cold fire. "That's what they did to us," he whispered. "We thought the march was the worst thing a man could endure. We were wrong. The march was just the road to the slaughterhouse." The real dying? The real dying had just begun. November 11th, 1942. The Lanao Plateau, Mindanao. The rain was a constant drum. It never stopped. Not for a day, not for an hour. There was an army in that jungle. An army that did not exist. An army that had been ordered to surrender. An army that refused. They were ghosts. Ghosts of Bataan. Ghosts of Corregidor. Men who had slipped through the Japanese lines, melting into the green hell of the mountains. They were Americans. They were Filipinos. They were soldiers without a flag, without a country, without orders. The official records in Washington, D.C. listed them as captured, or dead, or missing. The records were wrong, so very wrong. His name was Weddell Fertig. Lieutenant Colonel, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. He was 43. He was a mining engineer from Colorado, not a West Point man, not a frontline soldier. He built bridges. He supervised dams. He understood rock and stress and logistics. On Mindanao, he was supposed to be building roads. Then the bombs fell. The surrender order came from General Wainwright, a direct order. Fertig read it. He looked at the mountains. He burned the paper. That's how it began. He wasn't alone, not for long. They found him. Or he found them. Small bands of men, armed with whatever they had, old Enfield rifles, bolo knives, a few precious pistols. They were hungry, they were sick, they were hunted, but they were alive. And they were angry, so very angry. Fertig saw the anger. He saw the fire. An engineer looks for materials to build with. This was his material. The first meeting was in a nipa hut near Donsalon. The rain hammered the roof. Inside, a single candle flickered. There was Major Robert Ball, a Signal Corps officer. There was Captain Charles Hedges. There were Filipino officers, men like Lieutenant Colonel Teodoro Arvisu and Lieutenant Salipada Pendatun, a Muslim lawyer who commanded a force of Moro warriors. They argued, they shouted. Who was in command? Who gave the orders? Some wanted to fight in small bands, hit and run. Some wanted to hide, to wait. Fertig listened. He just listened. He was not a general, he was an engineer. He saw a problem of organization, and he began to solve it. "We are the United States Army," he said. His voice was quiet. The rain was louder than his voice. "We are the 10th Military District. We are still at war." Nobody believed. But the facts were there. He drew a map in the dirt, a command structure, divisions, regiments, companies. All on paper, all in his head. An army of ghosts, given names, given numbers, given purpose. The 105th Division in the north, the 108th in the east, the 109th in the south. Men who were once just survivors now had a unit, a home, a reason. It was crazy. It was impossible. But it was happening. And then the main thing started. The Japanese called them bandits, outlaws. The Kempeitai put a price on Fertig's head. 50,000 pesos, a fortune. They posted his picture in the towns. They sent patrols into the jungle. The patrols rarely came back, or they came back with fewer men. The jungle swallowed them. The jungle and the ghosts. Guerrilla actions were small, always small. A telephone line cut with a bolo knife. A single supply truck ambushed on a mountain pass. A bag of sugar poured into the fuel tank of a generator. Annoyances, pinpricks. But the pinpricks bled, and they sent a message. We are here. We are watching. We are waiting. The real war was a war of whispers. Intelligence. That was the gold. Fishermen counted the ships in Zamboanga Harbor. Laundry women in Davao listened to the talk of Japanese officers. Children noted the number of planes on the Del Monte airfield. The information moved from person to person. on scraps of paper hidden in baskets of fish, in the hollow of a bamboo pole, in the lyrics of a song. A bamboo telegraph, they called it. It was faster than radio, more reliable than spies. It was the people. Farmers, priests, doctors, mayors, children. All of them became soldiers in Fertig's ghost army. The network was vast, invisible, deadly. A report would appear on Fertig's desk. The folder was called Eyes Only, G2. It would say something simple. 3 transports, unescorted, departed Cebu heading south, ETA Surigao Strait, 0400. Simple and priceless. But information was useless if it stayed on the island. It had to get out. It had to reach Australia. It had to reach MacArthur. MacArthur. The name was a prayer on their lips. He had promised to return. They believed him. They had to believe him. They needed a radio, a powerful one. Major Ball, the signal corps man, went to work. They scavenged parts, a generator from an old sawmill, wires from a downed Japanese plane, vacuum tubes bought on the black market in Cagayan de Oro. They built it in a cave deep in the mountains of Misamis, powered by a diesel engine that drank precious stolen fuel. They called the radio Gloria, a prayer. The first transmissions were faint, just static in the listening posts in Darwin, Australia. Unintelligible noise. For weeks they tried. Failure after failure. The fuel ran low. The Japanese patrols got closer. The men grew tired. Hope was a flickering candle in the rain. Then, on a night in late January 1943, it happened. A clear signal, a coded message tapped out by a trembling hand. CQ? 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 KFS calling. KFS calling. KFS was Fertig's call sign. WZE was MacArthur's headquarters. For a long moment, there was only static. The jungle held its breath. The rain seemed to stop. The generator sputtered, and then a reply cut through the night. Faint. But it was there. A whisper from another world. Wazoo to KFS. Send your traffic. We read you. The operator started to weep. Silently, he kept tapping the key. Ball put a hand on his shoulder. Fertig stood in the mouth of the cave, looking out at the darkness. He held the decoded reply. It was more than a message. It was recognition. It was a lifeline. It was an order. An order for his ghost army to begin the real war. He was an engineer, and he had just built a bridge. A bridge of whispers across 1,000 miles of enemy ocean. April 4th, 1943. Davao Penal Colony, Mindanao. They said nobody ever escaped from Davao. They said the jungle would kill you if the guards did not. The guards were Japanese. The jungle was indifferent. Both were expert killers. But 10 Americans and 2 Filipinos were about to prove them wrong. They were about to walk out, not break out. Walk. They called themselves a grass-cutting detail. Just another work party. Under the drowsy afternoon sun, the guards were lazy, complacent. The prisoners were anything but. Major Stephen Melnick, Lieutenant Commander Melvin McCoy, Captain William Dias, Captain Austin Schaffner. These were not ordinary men. They were officers, leaders, survivors of Bataan and Corregidor. They had seen hell and memorized its geography. They walked calmly past the last checkpoint. No alarm, no shouts, just the quiet hum of insects and the pounding of their own hearts. One step, then another. They were outside the wire. They were free, and they were hunted. The jungle swallowed them whole, a world of green and shadow, of things that crawled and slithered and bit. For days they pushed through the kunai grass, sharp as razors that sliced their worn-out clothes and their skin. They waded through swamps, leeches clinging to their legs. Malaria bloomed in their blood, a feverish, shaking fire. They had one compass, a handful of rice, and a desperate, burning will. They had a plan. A vague plan. Find the guerrillas. Rumors in the camp had whispered of them. A ghost army in the mountains, an army led by an American. The Whispers called him Ferdig. They found them, or the guerrillas found them, a patrol of small, tough men with old rifles and bolo knives. They appeared from the trees like spirits. For a tense moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The escapees were skeletons in rags. The guerrillas were wary. Japanese spies were everywhere. Then one of the escapees spoke. A name. Ferdig. Colonel Wendell Ferdig. The name was a key. It unlocked a door. The guerrillas lowered their rifles. They led them to a camp hidden deep in the Lanao Plateau, a place that did not exist on any Japanese map. It was a kingdom of shadows. Colonel Fertig, a 42-year-old mining engineer from Colorado, had forged an army from nothing, from teachers, farmers, fishermen, escaped prisoners. His United States forces in the Philippines had a headquarters. They had a command structure. They had a radio. They had everything but supplies. Fertig's men gave the Davao Dozen what little they had: a roof made of nipa palm, a bowl of rice, bitter medicine made from the bark of the cinchona tree. They gave them safety, they gave them a chance, they gave them a voice. The stories began to pour out. The escapees talked, for hours, for days. They talked to Fertig's intelligence officers. The debriefing was relentless. The folder was labeled Escaped American Prisoners, Davao. It grew thicker each day. Captain Dias, a fighter pilot, described the death march from Bataan. The beatings, the starvation, the sun, the thirst, the beheadings, the men left to die on the roadside. He drew sketches of Japanese Zeros detailing their armor and their weaknesses. Lieutenant Commander McCoy, a submariner, recounted Japanese shipping schedules he had memorized: tonnage, routes, cargo. Major Melnick, an artillery expert, detailed the defenses of Corregidor, explaining exactly how the island fortress had fallen. It was intelligence. Raw, vital, damning intelligence. Information the outside world knew nothing about. Nobody knew. But the facts were there. Facts are always truthful. The radio crackled to life. A hand-cranked transmitter hidden in a mountain shack. Its call sign was KOS. Its signal was faint, a ghost on the airwaves. But it reached a listening post in Australia, General MacArthur's headquarters. The messages were short, coded, urgent. 10 U.S. officers escaped Davao, possess vital intel, require immediate evacuation. The messages were repeated, day after day, a desperate prayer sent into the ether. For weeks there was only silence. The jungle steamed. The men waited. Hope began to thin, stretching like worn fabric. Maybe no one was listening. Maybe no one cared. Then the reply came, a string of coded letters. Stand by. A submarine was coming, the USS Trout. The name was passed in whispers. A rendezvous was set, a secluded cove near Talingon Point on the northern coast of Mindanao. The journey to the coast was another ordeal. Days of hiking, hiding from Japanese patrols, moving only at night. They were ghosts again, flitting through the darkness, their lives hanging on the promise of a dark shape rising from the sea. July 23, 1943. Talingon Point. The beach was a sliver of white sand under a moonless sky. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of salt and fear. Every rustle of palm fronds was a footstep. Every shadow held a Japanese soldier. They waited. 2 hours? 3. Nothing. The Pacific was a vast, empty blackness. Hope curdled into dread. Maybe the message was a trap. Maybe the submarine was sunk. Maybe a flicker of light, far out at sea. 3 short flashes. The signal. An answering flash from a hooded torch on the shore. A rubber boat detached from a shadow that was darker than the surrounding water. A long, sleek shadow. The USS Trout had arrived. Paddles dipped silently. The boat grated on the sand. Figures emerged. American sailors. They looked impossibly clean. Impossibly healthy. The Davao Dozen, thin and ragged, waded into the surf. They were going home. They were carrying a story the world needed to hear. A story of unimaginable cruelty. The debriefing in Australia would be formal. Official. The report would land on MacArthur's desk. and the world's comfortable ignorance about the fate of the prisoners of Bataan was about to be shattered. Utterly shattered. March 31st, 1944. Off the coast of Cebu. It was a storm, a typhoon, the kind that rips the sky open and turns the sea into a gray, churning monster. A Japanese Kawanishi H-8K flying boat, lost and battered, tried to land on the water. It failed. The sea swallowed it whole. It swallowed the commander-in-chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet, Admiral Manichi Koga. It swallowed his staff. It swallowed his secrets. Almost. Local fishermen saw the crash. They were simple men, men who knew the tides, the reefs, the currents. They pulled a few survivors from the water, dazed and wounded, Japanese officers clutching their briefcases. They took them to the shore, to the waiting arms of the Cebu Area Command, the guerrillas, led by an American mining engineer, Lieutenant Colonel James M. Cushing. They didn't know who they had, not yet, but they knew what a briefcase meant. A briefcase in the hands of a drowning officer meant everything. And then they opened it. The folder was labeled ZAD Plan Operation. The documents inside were bound in red. Top secret. They were detailed tables, charts, operational orders. It was the Imperial Japanese Navy's entire plan for the decisive naval engagement they hoped would crush the American fleet. The final all-or-nothing gamble. Ship deployments, task force compositions, fuel and supply logistics, contingency plans. It was the heart of the enemy, ripped out and lying on a makeshift table in a jungle hut. Information was power, raw power, and Cushing's guerrillas were holding a lightning bolt. The Japanese knew it too. They knew what was lost. The search began immediately, frantic, desperate. They sent thousands of troops to scour the coast of Cebu. They offered rewards. They made threats. When threats failed, they turned to terror. Villages were burned. Civilians were interrogated with bamboo splints, with water, with fire. The Kempe Tai, the dreaded secret police, descended on the island. They were hunting for a ghost, for a set of papers that could lose them the war. They tortured, they killed, they burned, for a briefcase. But the jungle had 1,000 eyes and 1,000 ears. All of them belonged to the guerrillas. Deep in the central mountains, in a nipa hut camouflaged with palm fronds, a man hunched over a machine. The radio was an ugly, heavy box, a Gueric set built from scavenged parts. It was powered by a hand-crank generator, the constant, rhythmic squeal, a counterpoint to the chirping insects and the dripping rain. The operator, a former telephone lineman named Juanito, tapped out the message. A staccato burst of code into the humid night. The signal was weak, bouncing off the ionosphere, hoping to be caught by a listening post hundreds of miles away. In Australia, in MacArthur's headquarters. The message was simple, coded, urgent, package secured, contents priceless, await instructions. The reply came 2 nights later, a faint whisper of Morse code pulled from the static. Protect at all costs. Prepare for extraction. Submarine en route. The cost was already high. Villages disappeared from the map. Names were added to the long list of the missing. Santos, Reyes, Cruz, Ocampo. The price of the Z plan was paid in Filipino blood. Cushing moved the documents constantly, from a cave to a hollowed-out log to a sealed container buried beneath a church floor. The Japanese were always one step behind, always searching. The network was more than just men with guns. It was a living organism. It was the farmer who watched a Japanese patrol pass and reported its size. The child who counted the trucks on the road. The woman in the market who overheard 2 officers complaining about fuel shortages. The coast watcher on a distant hill tracking a cruiser steaming south. Every fragment of information was collected, collated, assessed. By men like Major Edwin F. Ramsey in central Luzon, by Major Macario Peralta on Panay, by Colonel Wendell Ferdig on Mindanao. Names whispered in command posts in Brisbane. Their reports arrived by radio, by runners, by hidden messages tucked into baskets of fish. They sent reports on everything: ship departures, troop concentrations, fuel depots, ammunition dumps, airfield conditions. They were MacArthur's eyes and ears. He was a blind man without them. He said it himself. The intelligence network was of incalculable value. Incalculable. The rendezvous was set. A moonless night off the southern coast of Negros, the neighboring island. The papers had to be moved. A small team of Cushing's best men carried the oilskin-wrapped package through miles of Japanese patrolled jungle. No talking, only hand signals. The snap of a twig could mean death. A cough could bring 100 enemy soldiers down on them. They slipped past checkpoints, forded rivers in the dark, their nerves stretched thin as wire. Then the sea. A small outrigger canoe pushed into the surf. They paddled out into the blackness, waiting, listening, for a signal that might never come. An hour passed, then another. Nothing but the sound of the waves. Had they been wrong? Was it a trap? And then a shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows of the night. A long, dark shape rising silently from the depths. The USS Creval. A single hooded light blinked 3 times. The signal. The canoe paddled frantically towards the submarine. Hands reached down from the conning tower, the package was passed up. Safe. The Z plan was on its way to MacArthur, on its way to Admiral Spruance and the Fifth Fleet. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, what the Americans would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, was still weeks away. But it was already won. Won in a storm off the coast of Cebu, won by fishermen, by a mining engineer, by a radio operator in a hut. One set of papers got out. One. But thousands of other messages were sent. Thousands of lives were risked on the crackle of a radio signal. For every message received, a village might burn. For every troop movement reported, an informant might be caught. The cost was never calculated, it couldn't be, and the radios kept crackling. Always crackling. In Luzon, in Visayas, in Mindanao, transmitting the secrets that would pave the way for the general's return. March 31st, 1944, off the coast of Cebu. It was a storm, a typhoon, the kind that rips the sky open and turns the sea into a gray, churning monster. A Japanese Kawanishi H-8K flying boat, the pride of the Imperial Navy's air arm, fought the wind. It lost. The giant machine, nicknamed Emily by the Allies, slammed into the water just 3 miles from the fishing village of Santander. It broke apart like a child's toy. Debris and bodies were scattered across the waves. By dawn, the local fishermen, part of Commander James M. Cushing's Cebu Area Command guerrillas, were already there. Picking through the wreckage, looking for survivors, looking for intelligence. They found both. One was a briefcase, waterproofed, chained to the wrist of a dead officer. A high-ranking officer from the Kempeitai. The case was opened back on shore, in a nipa hut that smelled of salt and dried fish. The documents inside were damp but legible. They were a threat analysis, an after-action report of failures. The folder was titled Insurrectionist Phantoms, a study of irregular warfare on Luzon, 1942. The author was a Major Kenji Tanaka. The report was his obsession, his nightmare. Tanaka wasn't writing about an army. He was writing about something he could not see, something he could not fight. He was writing about ghosts. This was the Ghost Army, not the American unit in Europe with inflatable tanks. No, this was a Filipino term, a name born of desperation and defiance. These ghosts were not soldiers in uniform. They were farmers, fishermen, priests, women, even children. They were the people, an army that wore no insignia, carried no flag, and held its battle lines in the hearts of its countrymen. They were everywhere, and they were nowhere. The report stated, "The enemy does not mass for battle. He melts. He dissolves into the landscape, into the villages, into the very population we are sworn to pacify. To identify him is to identify everyone." Tanaka was terrified. His report bled frustration. The tactics were a specter in the major's writing. He described the death march, the long, agonizing column of American and Filipino prisoners shuffling from Bataan to Camp O'Donnell. 75,000 men, but men kept disappearing. Not in large groups, one by one, two by two, vanishing from the line of march. The official Japanese count at the end never matched the count at the beginning. The discrepancy was thousands, thousands of men swallowed by the jungle. Swallowed by the people. A prisoner stumbles. He falls into a ditch. The guards scream, ready to bayonet him, but a woman, a simple villager offering a cup of water, blocks their view for a second. Just 1 second. When they look again, the ditch is empty. The prisoner is gone. A ghost. A farmer working his field near the road does not look up. He just keeps plowing with his carabao. But he leaves a single piece of sugarcane at the edge of the jungle. A small offering, a sign, a path to safety, another ghost. These were not pitched battles. This was warfare by whisper, by insinuation, by stealth. Major Tanaka listed the methods. He gave them names. The sudden crowd, where villagers would swarm a small group of guards, feigning a market day argument or a religious procession, and in the confusion, a prisoner would be pulled away. The broken cart, a pre-planned breakdown on a narrow path, halting the column, creating a moment of chaos just long enough for a man to slip into the dense foliage. Food drops, messages passed in folded banana leaves, signals made with laundry hung out to dry. White shirt, red pants, white shirt. It meant a patrol was coming. Red, white, red. The path is clear. It was a silent language of sabotage. A silent, brutally effective style. The challenge was insurmountable. Tanaka wrote of the psychological toll. Every civilian was a potential enemy. The man sharpening his bolo knife, was he merely preparing to cut bamboo, or was he waiting for a Japanese soldier to walk past? That woman selling rice cakes, did she put something in them? Is she counting our numbers? The paranoia was the guerrillas' greatest weapon. It was more effective than 1,000 rifles. It turned the Japanese occupiers into prisoners themselves, trapped by suspicion, trapped by their own fear of the ghosts. They couldn't trust anyone. Not the field hands, the dock workers, the house servants, the local officials. Santos, Reyes, Cruz, De La Cruz, Garcia, Mendoza. The names were a blur. The faces were a blur. They were the population. They were the enemy. An army you can see, you can fight. An army you can count. An army you can defeat. But how do you defeat a ghost? A ghost who looks just like the man you bought fish from this morning? How do you kill an idea? You can't. It was impossible. Tanaka knew it. His report was a cry for help, a plea for a new strategy, one that did not exist. The guerrillas in the nipa hut finished reading. The storm had passed. The sun was breaking over the island of Cebu. They looked at each other. The dead Kempeitai major had written their history. He had documented their victories. He had validated their struggle. He had given them a name. Ghost Army. They would wear it with pride. But Tanaka's report was not just history. The final pages were not about 1942. They were about the future. About now. 1944. The major detailed the schedule for a new series of prisoner transfers between the islands. A secret schedule. He outlined routes, guard strengths, and timetables. A plan to prevent the ghosts from striking again. The report was a weapon designed to hunt them, but in the hands of the guerrillas it became a map to the next harvest of souls. June 7th, 1943, Agusan Valley, Mindanao. A man could live on 3 cups of rice a day, for a while. Then his body started to eat itself. The Japanese Imperial Army requisitioned everything. The rice, the carabao, the chickens, the fish from the rivers, everything. The official ration for a Filipino civilian was a ghost of a meal, a memory of food that left the stomach screaming. It was a weapon. Slower than a bayonet, but just as certain. Starvation was policy, but there was another government in the Philippines, a government of shadows. It operated out of jungle clearings and remote barrios. Its president was a U.S. Army colonel named Wendell Fertig. Its currency was scrip, promissory notes printed on whatever paper could be found. Its law was survival, and its first duty was to feed its people. The guerrillas, the escapees, the civilians caught in the crossfire, an army needed to eat, an army of ghosts. They called it the Food Procurement Section, a grand name for a desperate enterprise. It was run by men like Major Macario Garcia, a former schoolteacher who now commanded a battalion of farmers with captured Arisaka rifles. They organized clandestine harvests in the dead of night, fields of rice reaped by moonlight, the grains threshed in silence and spirited away on the backs of men and women before the sun rose. They had secret granaries, hidden under the floors of Nepa huts in caves sealed with boulders, buried in waterproof oil drums deep in the forest. 1 sack of rice was life. 10 sacks were a victory. 100 was a miracle. Lieutenant John Miller, 26th Cavalry, was a walking skeleton when they found him. He had escaped the Davao penal colony 2 months prior. 2 months of hell. He weighed less than 100 pounds. Malaria shook him with bone-rattling chills. Beriberi had swollen his legs to the size of tree trunks, his heart pounding like a drum against his ribs. He was dying. A patrol from Garcia's unit found him collapsed by the Agusan River, delirious, mumbling about a horse named Bess. They carried him for 2 days through the jungle. Not to a camp, to a small village near Cabadbaran, to a woman. Her name was Dr. Sofia Reyes, 42 years old, a graduate of the University of Santo Tomas Medical School. Her clinic was the back room of a nipa hut, the air thick with the smell of herbal poultices and boiled roots. She had no anesthetics. Barely any bandages. Her surgical tools were sterilized in a boiling pot over an open fire. Quinine, sulfa drugs, morphine, bandages, iodine. They were rarer than gold, more precious than diamonds. The medicine came from, nobody knew for sure. Some said from smugglers out of Borneo. Some whispered about a submarine rendezvousing on a moonless night off the coast. Maybe from Fertig's command, maybe from a secret drop. The rumors were a shield. Dr. Reyes took one look at Lieutenant Miller and went to work. There was no quinine for his malaria. She used a bitter tea brewed from the bark of the dita tree, an old folk remedy. It was a gamble. For the beriberi, she fed him tiki, a thick brown extract made by pounding rice bran, a substance the Japanese considered waste. For his dehydration, she had no sterile saline solution for an IV, so she used the water from a young green coconut, filtered through a clean cloth, administered with a sharpened bamboo needle. It was a desperate act, a piece of jungle medicine whispered from mother to daughter. It was impossible, but it worked. Miller lived. He was one of dozens. Dozens of American escapees, Filipino soldiers, and wounded guerrillas who passed through her secret clinic. A ghost hospital for a ghost army. Risk. That was the currency. Not pesos, not dollars. Risk. For every guerrilla who collected food, there was a civilian who hid it. For every wounded soldier treated, there was a doctor or a nurse who risked their life to save him. The Santos family, on the outskirts of Jabonga, kept a false floor in their home. Beneath it, 10 sacks of rice. 10 sacks that belonged to the guerrillas. The Kempetai, the Japanese military police, searched their house 3 times. They beat the father, Mateo Santos, for information he did not have. His son, 16-year-old Ramon, acted as a runner for Major Garcia, carrying messages tucked into hollowed-out bamboo poles. The Cruzes, the Garcias, the Delgados, the Reyes. Each family had a secret, a hidden American, a buried radio part, a bag of rice, a bottle of medicine. They knew the price. Everyone knew the price. In the barrio of Santiago, a Japanese patrol found a crate of American K rations in a farmer's barn. They said it was for the banditos. The farmer, his 2 sons, and 7 other men from the village were taken to the plaza. 10 men. lined up against the bullet-scarred wall of the old Spanish church. Their names were read from a list. The Kempeitai officer did not shout. He spoke calmly. He explained the crime. Aiding the enemy. He explained the punishment. Collective responsibility. The entire barrio was forced to watch. The shots echoed across the valley. Then they burned the barn. And the house. That was the price of a can of corned beef hash. And then the main thing started. Late in July, a guerrilla raiding party hit a small Japanese garrison near Butuan. It was a quick, brutal fight. They captured documents, a metal footlocker full of papers. Most of it was supply requisitions, troop rosters, boring army bureaucracy. They were about to burn it, but one of Garcia's men, a former clerk from Manila, noticed a folder. It was different. Bound in black cardboard? The characters on the front were stark. The folder was labeled Bamboo Snake. Inside were lists, pages and pages of names, civilian names, barrio by barrio. Beside each name were notes. Suspected food supplier. Brother is a guerrilla. Heard speaking English. Attended party for American officer in 1939. It was an intelligence file. A Kempeitai list of sympathizers. A death list in waiting. Major Garcia scanned the pages for Cabadbrin, his heart cold. And then he saw it. Dr. Sofia Reyes. A whole paragraph. Treats wounded bandidos and escaped POWs. Source of illegal medicine. Highly dangerous. Priority for interrogation. Her name was third on the list. February 3rd, 1946, Manila. The city was a skeleton, a corpse picked clean by bombs and fire. The legislative building stood hollowed out, its neoclassical columns like broken teeth against a gray sky. They were holding a parade on the rubble of Dewey Boulevard, a victory parade, 1 year after the battle for Manila began. American flags and new Philippine flags snapped in the sea breeze. There were speeches. General MacArthur was a god. The Americans were liberators. The politicians who had returned with them were the new government. But the ghosts were there too. They stood in the shells of burned-out buildings. They watched from the shadows of Intramuros, where 10,000, 100,000 had died. They were the men and women who had actually fought here for 3 years. The guerrillas. And nobody mentioned their names. The war was over. The accounting had begun. In a series of Quonset huts near the port, the U.S. Army's Recovered Personnel Division tried to make sense of the chaos. They had lists. So many lists. Rosters compiled by American officers who had escaped Corregidor. Radioed reports from submarines. Files from MacArthur's headquarters in Brisbane. To be a hero, you had to be on the list. If your commander was an American, you might get on the list. If your unit had a working radio, you might get on the list. If you did not, you were a ghost, a civilian, a footnote. 260,000 guerrillas were eventually recognized. 260,000. That's 10 full divisions, an entire army. But the real number was higher. Maybe 400,000, maybe 500,000. Nobody knew. The men who fought under Filipino leaders, the farmers who picked up bolos and old rifles, the women who carried messages and dynamite, they were not on the list. They had fought the same war, died the same deaths, but they did not exist. Not officially. And then there were the others, the Hukbalahap, the people's anti-Japanese army. In central Luzon, they had been the resistance. They had established their own shadow governments, their own justice. They killed more Japanese than many of the U.S. AFF-E-led units. Luis Taruk, their leader, was a hero. For a time. Then the Americans returned. The Hooks were communists. That was the whisper. Communists, agrarian reformers, a threat. The U.S. Army ordered them to disarm. The new Philippine government, filled with landed elites, landlords, and pre-war politicians, saw them as a bigger threat than the Japanese ever were. The same soldiers who had ambushed Japanese patrols were now being hunted in the hills by the new Philippine constabulary. Their names were not just left off the list, they were put on new lists. lists of subversives, lists of traitors. The hero of yesterday becomes the outlaw of today. That's how it works. That is always how it works. Their bodies were the evidence, their memories were the testimony. The guerrillas knew where the mass graves were. Jolo, Palawan, Calamba. They had lists of their own scribbled on the back of Japanese propaganda leaflets, on banana leaves, in tiny notebooks made of scrap paper. Names of victims, dates of massacres, the identities of the Kempeitai officers who gave the orders. But when the International Military Tribunal for the Far East convened in Tokyo, their voices were absent. The prosecution presented documents, official reports, the testimony of high-ranking officers. The stories of a barefoot farmer from Batangas who watched his village burn were not official. The account of a schoolteacher from Cebu who had counted the beheaded bodies was not official. It was hearsay. It was rumor. The truth of the trenches, the jungle, the occupied towns was buried under the weight of official procedure. The ghosts were not invited to the trial, so the silence began. A long, deep silence that lasted for decades. The war was remembered through the fall of Bataan, the return of MacArthur, the flag-waving liberation. The 3 years in between? A blur. The country was busy rebuilding. A new republic was being forged, and its foundation story needed to be simple, clean. The messy, complicated, often brutal story of the resistance did not fit. It was a story of 100 different private armies, of rivalries between guerrilla leaders, of summary executions, of heroes who were also communists and collaborators who were also patriots. It was too complex, too dirty, so they were forgotten. Their stories became family lore, whispered from grandfather to grandchild, but absent from the history books. Their memorials were not in the capital. They were small, crumbling markers in remote provincial plazas, a simple cross on a hillside, or nothing at all. Just a spot in the jungle that everyone knew was haunted. A haunted place for a nation of ghosts. 2017. The Philippine National Archives, Manila. A young woman named Ana Reyes sits in the reading room. She is a historian, or trying to be. The air is thick with the sweet, decaying smell of old paper and binder's glue. She is surrounded by gray archival boxes. Declassified files from the U.S. Veterans Administration. The folder is called Philippine Resistance, Unrecognized Groups Luzon. It is one of 1,000 such folders, a graveyard of paper. She is not looking for heroes. She is looking for a single name, her great-grandfather's name, a man they said was a guerrilla captain in the Sierra Madre, a man with no papers, no proof, a ghost. 60 miles away in a small concrete house in Bulacan, Lolo Pedro sits on a plastic chair. He is 97. His skin is a map of wrinkles. His eyes are cloudy. He fought with the Bulacan military area guerrillas. He was 20 years old. He does not have official medals from the American or Philippine governments. His medals are in a small wooden box. A St. Christopher medal he took from a dead Japanese soldier. A small hand-carved piece of wood in the shape of an eagle. And a notebook. A small black notebook, its pages brittle and yellow. Inside, in faded pencil, are names. Hundreds of names. Men he fought with, men who died, men who disappeared. Acosta, Bernabe, Cruz, De La Rosa, Enriquez, Garcia, a litany of the forgotten. He recites them sometimes, to himself. A promise he made. Anna finds a list, a roster. From a unit called the Valorous Legion. She had never heard of it. It is not on any official USAF chart. The paper is a mimeograph copy, blurry and faint. She recognizes the name of a town, San Ildefonso, her great-grandfather's town. She runs her finger down the list of names, and then she sees it. Captain Isagani Reyes, her ghost. A surge of adrenaline, cold and sharp. The paper feels electric, a ghost made real. But it is the other names that hold her. She begins to cross-reference them with other files. Post-war constabulary reports. Files on the Hook Insurgency. One by one, the names from the Valorous Legion roster appear on other lists. Hook sympathizers, subversives, men arrested in 1947-1950. Men who were heroes in 1944 were enemies of the state by 1946. The unseen army that held the line against Japan became the unseen enemy within. Their legacy was not a monument. It was a fault line running deep through the nation's politics. A division between the official story and the people's story. A ghost army, a ghost legacy. Their presence was not in the statues, it was in the land disputes, the insurgencies, the deep-seated distrust of the government in Manila. They were invisible, and they were everywhere. Late afternoon. The light in the archive is failing. Anna has 3 lists spread before her on the dark wood of the table. The U.S. AFFE list of recognized heroes. The constabulary list of subversives, and a high-resolution photograph of a page from a notebook, emailed to her by a relative who had visited an old man in Bulacan. Lolo Pedro's notebook. Her eyes scan the columns. A name jumps out. A name on all 3 lists. Major Dominador Garcia, a recognized hero of the resistance, awarded the Distinguished Service Cross by the U.S. Congress. A notorious anti-Huck commander in the post-war army. And in Lolo Pedro's notebook, next to his name, was a single spidery word. A word that made no sense. A word that changed everything. Ganap. And beside it, a date. October 1944, before the Americans even landed. The Ganap Party was a pro-Japanese political faction. Traitors, collaborators. The hero was a collaborator. The collaborator was a hero. The ghost had 2 faces. The file lay open. The silence in the archive was absolute. And the real investigation began. How does history account for an army that officially never was? How does a nation remember warriors erased from the rosters, men who became ghosts to fight a phantom war? The truth does not reside in formal archives. It flickers in fragments. It lives in the memory of a salvaged Japanese briefcase, its secrets pulled from the sea near Santander. It survives in the coded messages passed with a meager ration of rice, a ghost of a meal that fueled a revolution. It persists in the shadows that moved between razor-sharp kunai grass and the endless shuffling columns of the damned. The official narrative is one of surrender, of broken men stumbling under a brutal tropical sun, their hope evaporating under the glint of bayonets. The truth remained somewhere else, between the lines, between the silences. They were marked as defeated. They became a phantom force. They were prisoners of war. They became hunters in their own land. They were the fallen, the lost, the surrendered. And yet, they were the eyes and ears of a future victory, a spectral web of defiance stretching across the islands. This was not a war of grand battles and captured territory. It was a war of whispers, a war of shadows, a war of ghosts, a resistance not of firepower but of pure will. A victory not measured in miles, but in lives saved and secrets stolen. An audacity born not from strength, but from the very heart of despair, in the hollowed-out legislative buildings that stood like broken teeth against a gray sky. A rebellion of spirit. A rebellion of memory. The paper trail goes cold. The witnesses are gone. The official records are silent, complicit in their erasure. But some secrets do not die with those who kept them. They are woven into the land itself, into the stories passed down through generations. History remembers the marches of the dead. It is the whispers of the ghost army, however, that truly haunt us, asking the same question over and over. What does it mean to win a war you were never meant to fight?